Okay, today's mini lecture is going just to be pretty brief, a lot briefer than the ones before, because we're just talking about 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And kind of the big idea that you need to know, as you've probably picked up in your reading, the author of Chronicles, the chronicler, I always call him, we don't know him by name, but he's writing to the audience that's come back out of the Babylonian exile, and we're talking about some precipitating events that are behind the fact that they were able to come back. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But the Babylonians are on the decline, and the Persians, or the Medes, are on the rise. And of all of the exilic policies, the Persians are going to have the most friendly towards their captives. In fact, we're going to see, due to the behind-the-scenes work of well-named Old Testament figures, namely Daniel, a lot of things going on behind the scenes. Those special ops prophets like Daniel are used by God in a dramatic way. In other words, they're helping to tip the dominoes over that precipitate these decrees. Anytime Daniel was miraculously delivered, whether from a fiery furnace or from a lion's den, you've got these Persian kings issuing decrees in Israel's favor. So you recall last time we talked about the exiles that took place, not only for Israel in the north, but for Judah in the south. Daniel, for example, is going to be part of that the first wave of deportees in 605. Ezekiel, for example, will be the prophet who goes to Babylon, the Babylonian exile in the second wave, and then finally the third wave of deportees occurs during the fall, that is the destruction of Jerusalem. So Judah falls in 586. Persia is going to conquer Babylon just a few years later in 539. Then we've got Daniel working behind the scenes, and I've put the connection in red there. Cyrus, the Persian king, is going to issue a decree in 538. And this is going to be the one that is going to allow the Israelites to come back to the Promised Land under the leadership of Zerubbabel, Ezra, and Nehemiah. So we're going to cover those books next time. But first we're going to cover Chronicles, because like Ezra and like Nehemiah, the history books that unpack that historical period, there's an audience. So the audience is back in the Promised Land. They're dead serious about establishing covenant life and worshiping the one true God, Yahweh. And all of these things are true. As we'll see, Ezra's concerned, he's the priest, concerned for the spiritual rebuilding. Nehemiah is going to be responsible for the wall rebuilding. You might say Zerubbabel is giving oversight to the rebuilding of the temple so that Israel can be a covenant people once again. So in 536, we've got the first group of returnees under Zerubbabel. They're going to experience the temple rebuilding opposition in Ezra's 5 through 6. And of course, Daniel 6 is what's going on behind the scenes to create a Darius. Darius is going to issue a decree that allows the temple rebuilding construction to continue. And then the temple will be completed. The prophets Zechariah and Haggai will be in operation, encouraging the same group of returnees that the author of Chronicles is also writing and recasting this historical period, the previous historical period, that period of United Kingdom and Divided Kingdom, 400 years plus 120 years, so 520 years. That 520-year period is going to be recast by the author of Chronicles for this group of returnees. So one of the big ideas that we need to see is his theological agenda, spiritually guided, of course, will be different. He's going to tell that historical period in a different way. We have Esther behind the scenes in Persia, somewhat overlapping here. Ezra will come back and bring the second group of returnees back to the Promised Land in 457, serving as the priest. And then under Artaxerxes, Nehemiah in 444 will come back. And become a governor and a leader and overseer, as well as a great leader with regards to the rebuilding of the walls project. So you can see there's a lot going on, and a lot of this history kind of overlaps a lot of different books, prophetic books or history books that we have in our Old Testament canon. So we'll be really brief about this. I've already covered a lot of this, the big ideas that I want you to keep in mind and at least know about for First and Second Chronicles. But it's going to cover the same basic history of Samuel Kings. Chronicles is going to begin with Saul. And it was probably written sometime during or slightly after the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem, called the Second Temple period, between the years 518 and 70 AD, when that Second Temple was destroyed. The significant difference between Chronicles and Samuel Kings is the way Israel's history is portrayed. So the audience is this post-exilic group. So the post-exilic concerns for this group, you can only imagine. Pictured there is the temple. So anything related to the temple will be brought in full detail. Anything related to the positive, good news that it will encourage this group that's come back. What does God have planned for us? Well, we're going to see major focus in Chronicles on the good kings in Israel's history and Judah's history, actually Judah's history, the reform efforts of these kings like Hezekiah and Josiah, and the foundational piece of the whole thing is the Davidic covenant, King David, Nathan's oracle to King David, and what it promises with regards to Israel's future, despite the failure of the kings in that 400 and some year period of divided kingdom largely. The question they're asking, is God given up on us, or has God got something more for us? The answer of the chronicler is absolutely yes. And let me go back and focus on those historical high points that seal the deal and make it very clear that God's not given up on us. So you can see First Chronicles is, the primary focus. A lot of the airplay will be focusing on the wholehearted king, King David. One of the things I haven't said yet is that the author of Chronicles had access to his Bible, which included the historical accounting that we have in Kings. He had access to that as source material. So the author of Chronicles had access to that material as well as some other source materials. He had the option of pulling from and bringing it into his divinely inspired work. So you see some things that are left out, and in Chronicles you see some things that are unique or added to. For example, 1 Chronicles 1 through 9, you've got lots of information given with regards to the genealogies. So why would that have been important, we ask? What's the theological significance of genealogies? Well, for one, it keeps track of who's related to who. But at a time that was when it was really important to understand who belonged to who with regards to what was previously known as the division of the land. You remember the last time we saw a lot of genealogies was back in Joshua when the land was divided up amongst tribal groups. Well, these tribal names are still around, and they've come back out of the Babylonian exile under Persian rule after 70 years, and they want to go back to their land allotments. They want to go back and settle and reestablish their households. So genealogies and knowing, and also to legitimize who's a legitimate Levitical priest, for example. You see that focus as well. The Levitical priests are important at this time because they're the ones going back to the temple, and they're going to help give oversight to the worship and to the sacrificial system and to oversight of the festivals and the religious festivals that will be going on and necessary to jazz up and revitalize Israel's covenant life and vitality. One glaring example that we see in 1 Chronicles chapters 10 through 29, if you go back in Samuel and you see how much time was spent discussing Israel's first king, King Saul, compared to how much time the chronicler gives to Saul. One chapter, chapter 10, and that's it. So in other words, there's an example of the theological agenda of the chronicler. He does not want to retell the story of Saul because everybody knows that King Saul was not the king. They all know why, and they could go back and read it for themselves in the history book of Kings if they want to. Perhaps the most famous omission, you might say, theologically motivated, of course, if you turn to 1 Chronicles chapter 20 and you read verse 1, then it happened in the spring at the time when kings go out to battle that Joab led out the army and ravaged the land and the sons of Ammon and came and besieged Rabbah. But David stayed at Jerusalem, and Joab struck Rabbah and overthrew it. We've heard that before. We've heard that before back in Samuel, but notice in verse 2, and David took the crown of their king from his head, and he found it to weigh a talent of gold. And you know, it's like, wait a minute, something's missing. What's missing from this context is anything with regards to David's sin with Bathsheba. The author of Chronicles, the chronicler, left it out completely. Why is that? Well, they already know. They're all familiar with that. They can go back and read the account in Samuel Kings, or they can read Psalm 51 if they want to, and understand what happened to King David and how he responded to it. But really, what the chronicler is more important about with King David is the Davidic covenant. Anything that has to do with religious reforms. Not the bad news or the negative stuff. The author of Chronicles is going to highlight the positive and the forward-looking stuff. And this is one of when you have your interpretation or hermeneutics class, you'll learn that this is one of the features of understanding the Old Testament text is the issue of selectivity. And if you've got repeat information, sometimes the author, we have to allow him to be selective with regards to what he chooses to include and what he chooses to omit from his divinely inspired written account. Similarly to Solomon in 2 Chronicles 1 through 9, the highlight of Solomon's, of course, career as king would be the temple building. And of course you can understand why the author of Chronicles would want to make that a feature focus of his book, is because that's what they're doing. In fact, all the details, all the glamour, all the glitz is included because that's an encouragement to the rebuilders who are operating in that post-exilic period. So that's the emphasis that the author of Chronicles is going to give, and also just the fact of Solomon, you know, his commemoration, prayer, and speech, and the dedication of the temple, and all of these things are going to be a feature focus in the author of Chronicles. The details about Solomon and his syncretistic tendencies with regards to taking in all these pagan women, and all the emphasis on gold, collecting of gold, and all that Deuteronomy 17:14 through 20 assessment largely is taken out of the chronicler's account of King Solomon. The author wants to know and remind his readers of the things that Solomon did that reflected the heart that he had, the half of it that was full, and committed to doing the things that God had asked him to do, and he did them as an application of his wisdom, for example. So we'll move on. The last part of 2 Chronicles in chapters 10 through 36 is going to be primarily focused on, and by now you'd probably be able to guess, the reforming kings in Judah. There's going to be a lot of focus and emphasis on Hezekiah and Josiah in the closing chapters. The destruction of Jerusalem is going to be the very last chapter in Chronicles in chapter 36. One thing I want to do, and let's turn there together, I want to show you something that's kind of unique and kind of a cool thing that most people haven't the foggiest idea that's there. But let me show you. If you turn to 2 Chronicles chapter 36, you have to understand, in the original ordering of the Old Testament books in the Hebrew canon, chapter 36 would have been our last chapter in the book of Revelation. The Chronicles is the last book in the Hebrew canon. So the very last thing that you read about in the closing chapter, literally, of the Hebrew canon is, there it is, the Cyrus Decree. Now, before we read the version in the Cyrus Decree that begins in verse 22, I want to show you, if you just turn one page over in your English arrangement of the canon, the Cyrus Decree is the thing that gets the whole thing started. So it becomes the starting point for Ezra. But notice it's the ending point for the chronicler, which is really interesting. And if you look and read, I'll let you read it yourself, but if you go down to verse 3, whoever there is among you of all his people. So this is the Cyrus Decree. These are the words that Cyrus wrote down and decreed for Israel and anybody else that needed to hear it. May his God be with him. Let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and rebuild the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. He is the God who is in Jerusalem. And every survivor at whatever place that he may live, let him, men of that place, support him with silver and gold, goods and cattle, and freewill offerings for the house of God, which is in Jerusalem. So there's the Cyrus Decree that basically does focus on this temple in Jerusalem and the rebuilding activity that's taking place there. All right, so all good and fine and dandy so far, but if you turn one page back, what do we see? Verse 23, the beginning of the Cyrus Decree. So it's verbatim for what we see and what we've read in Ezra so far. Thus says King Cyrus of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build him a house in Jerusalem. So we've heard this before, which is in Judah. Whoever there is among you of all of his people, may the Lord his God be with him, and let him go up. Flip back to Ezra, and you can see that the author of Chronicles has cut the Cyrus Decree right in the half of verse 3. Let him go up to Jerusalem is the invitation. The invitation is to go up to Jerusalem, to the temple. We have to ask ourselves the question, is this a huge textual error or a problem for textual criticism to solve? Is this a contradiction of some kind? Is this, what is going on here? One of the things that, if you put your thinking cap on and understand the author of Chronicles and what he's trying to do, notice that the very last word is a verb. It's an invitation. And where are they invited to go? Well, let's turn over to Isaiah chapter 60, verses 1 through 5. Of course, the Zion theology is developed in the prophets, and that would have been around for some time. The Zion theology, which really focuses on the rebuilt Jerusalem, the new city, and the temple, and that's the place where God Himself will sit and rule on His throne. This Zion idea: arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord has risen upon you. Chapter 60, verse 1 and 2 in Isaiah. For behold, darkness will cover the earth, and deep darkness the peoples. But the Lord will rise upon you, and His glory will appear upon you. And nations will come to you and to your light, and your kings to the brightness of your rising. Lift up your eyes around about and see. They all gather together. They come to you. Notice the motion. Notice the movement. Where are people leaving from, and where are they going to? Your sons will come from afar, and your daughters will be carried in the arms. Then you will see and be radiant, and your heart will thrill and rejoice, because of the abundance of the sea will be turned to you. The wealth of the nations will come to you. Verse 13 in chapter 60. So again, where are they going? The glory of Lebanon will be to you, the juniper, the box tree, the cypress together, to beautify the place of my sanctuary, and I will make the place of my feet glorious. Verse 14. And the sons of those who afflicted you will come bowing to you, and all those who despised you will bow themselves at the soles of your feet, and then they will call you the city of the Lord, the Zion, the Holy One of Israel. They're coming to the New Jerusalem. They're coming to the place where they'll be able to bow at the feet of the saints and worship and engage in the one true living God who's ruling and reigning. So it's not just any old Jerusalem, the chronicler says, and it's not necessarily even this Jerusalem and this temple, the chronicler says. By cutting the Cyrus Decree, he's cutting off the words of this Persian king Cyrus, and he's pointing ahead to a future time, right? When all Israel and all of the exiles and anybody out there who's listening can hear this invitation, let them go up. And the invitation, I think, is a strong, you might say, here's the fancy word. You didn't think that this was in the Old Testament, but eschatological invitation. So there's an eschatological invitation. God's going to do something in the future. It's going to be in Jerusalem. It's going to be at a, you hear my wood knocking? Knock on wood, real place. It's going to involve perhaps even a new heaven and a new earth. So there's this eschatological, open-ended invitation there, and I think it's pretty intentional. And I won't get into all the details, but there's, for you eager beavers out there, if you want to look up the last word of Chronicles chapter 36, the let them go up, is a Hebrew word that's also inserted as an extra word in the chronicler's account of the Davidic covenant in David's prayer. It's translated kind of odd, and a lot of translators, quite frankly, don't know what to do with it. And there's a lot of scholarly debate about it, but it's the same word, and I don't think it's a textual error or some kind of scribal slip of the pen. I think it's an intentional insertion. It's the same word that's translated in Psalms for the Psalms of Ascent. It's the word that's translated ascent or upward. It's the let him go up verb with a meme on the front end, with a hey on the front end attached to it, turns it into a noun form of a participle. So it's the ascent or the going up idea, and it shows up, and the author of Chronicles adds it in there. And I'm doing some research and writing on this even as we speak, so it's kind of exciting. I'm giving you a little bit of my own current thinking on the idea. So I think the whole thing attaches this eschatological invitation here at the end of Chronicles to the Davidic covenant, which is all about something that God's going to do in the future with the Davidic kingdom, a David-like king, the reestablishment of his kingdom and the throne, and where someone in his line will sit someday and rule over his people and do a lot of things, according to the other prophets, like establish peace for his people. The lion will lay down with the lamb in Isaiah chapter 11, and all of those things, a renewed heart for God's people, Jeremiah 31 through 33, and some of those things are all about what's going to happen, what God's going to do in the future. The exciting thing for us, and if you just want to turn off your computer and have a worship moment right now, just let me remind you that all of these things are future for us too. Jesus is coming back. Just let me remind you, the world that we live in has fallen. There's suffering and pain all around, and we read the headlines. I was reminded from my brother this morning in a text that in his neighborhood there was shooting number 4 the last month. He's about ready to sell his house. But these are the things that happen, right? People have cancer in the hospital, and we have to go visit them over the weekend and try to encourage them. How will we do that? If they're a believer, if they have faith, one of the things that we can gently remind them of is that the ultimate response to sin and suffering is this future place where there will be no more sin and suffering. The curse of sin will be defeated, and death will be no more, and we'll be able to live in our sin-free bodies in a real knock-on-wood place, and to be able to fully experience God's presence and express fully the image that He put in us from the very beginning. So, sorry, got a little chatty there. Sally chatty, as my wife would say, but I just want to encourage you with that. Some of you are serving overseas. Some of you are in Africa and Cambodia and London. I've heard from you, and if this encourages the socks off of you, then I hope that it's a divine moment. But this is where we are, and it all comes from the Old Testament. So there you go. Let me just pause for a second. So 24 minutes and 50 seconds. I'm going to end this little mini little mini lecture at. You can see the Persian Empire got big. Of course, they were after Egypt in the south. Little Judah was allowed to come back and return. Persians allowed them to come back under the leadership of Ezra. Zerubbabel actually is the first, Ezra second, and Nehemiah third. Each one of those individuals brought back groups of people out of the Babylonian exile. Now, here's the thing that I'll leave you with now, and we'll cover it again in the spring when we talk about the book of Ezekiel. But one of the things, the amazing things that God did in in Persia, where the exiles were by the river Shebar, is that he was their pastor, he was their priest, he was their prophet during that 70 years in exile, such that, of all the exiles that went, a lot of them went there pretty much half-baked pagans, succumbed to the syncretism and all of the things that the kings had, in Judah and the south had succumbed to the syncretistic pressure. They go to Babylon, half-baked pagans, but they come back 22,000 plus, totally transformed. There's that refining idea over that 70 years. It's like the wilderness experience all over again. So for this group of exiles, 22,000 plus come back. What changed them was, I would argue, Ezekiel's prophetic preaching ministry. He's addressing them covenantally. He is their Moses all over again in that time period. So there's a lot to say about this time period, but God was very active in redirecting his people. And there's the grace, right? It's harsh, yes. Traveling over that journey was difficult, yes. Did people die? Did generations pass on to, yes. But a generation emerges, and they're wanting to do it right. So that's what's going on. And we'll cover Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther next week when we come back, and that'll be really the end of our historical period. And then we'll get ready for the final exam, and we'll have the argumentation. So if you don't have a lot of work, here's a little breather room for you this week. I'd encourage you to be looking at that argumentation assignment and really thinking through. Now, let me remind you, as a way of reminder, I've given you a whole bunch of guidance there in Blackboard. The video, the how-to video, how to get full-text articles if you're an online learner. You still have access to our library, so I just want to remind you of that. Watch that video if you've never done that before. Accessing our video via the internet, via the Swibbits website, and you have access to lots of full-text journal articles. You can go do a little search and in a short amount of time find the article that is the just right article for you that would help you think through at a little more deeper level what is the issue surrounding your text and what thesis that you're trying to make. A lot of you are writing, of course, about the grace of God in the Old Testament. So I've helped you to do that and guided you to that thesis statement. Let that guide you now in your research. So spend a little time. We don't, First and Second Chronicles, it's not a heavy hitter this next week. So you've got a little breather room. Fill that time working on your argumentation, and we'll talk to you next time. I hope this was helpful for you. Thanks.